I ain't paying. The Titan's voice, sharp as shattered glass, ricocheted off the hushed diners. Chloe, she just stood there, apron starched, a smudge of graphite still clinging to her wrist from her other life. The one where she designs buildings, not serves overpriced egos. 74 grand. Pocket lint to him. To her, a year's tuition. But here's the thing. Thorne, blinded by his own bluster, thinks she's just a waitress. He doesn't see the steel in her spine, the quiet fire in her eyes. He definitely doesn't know whose number she's dialing. Big mistake, because that quiet kindness she shows everyone, it's about to become his undoing. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Not a clue. He laughed, a short, sharp, dismissive bark. I'm not paying this, he declared the words, cutting through the restaurant's hushed ambience. Every eye turned. The manager began to sweat. But the waitress, Chloe, just stood there, her expression unreadable, before she calmly reached into her apron, pulled out her phone and said, "Then I'll have to call the owner." Eith's was not merely a restaurant. It was a sanctuary of calculated opulence nestled in the heart of Manhattan. It didn't advertise. It had no sign, only a single burnished bronze door set into a wall of ivy-covered brownstone. To dine there was to announce you had not just arrived, but had conquered. The interior was a symphony of dark mahogany supple, the color of dried blood and lighting so artfully dimmed it made everyone look like a subject in a Rembrandt painting. The air itself seemed filtered, carrying only the faintest, most tantalizing whispers from the kitchen truffle-seared scallops in the sweet, buttery scent of ambition. Tonight, the gravitational center of the room was Table 7, the prime alcove overlooking the restaurant's private Zen garden. And at the head of that table sat Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man sculpted from confidence and contempt. His suit was a custom-tailored Tom Ford, his watch a PC Fipe that cost more than the average American home, and his smile was a weapon deployed with strategic precision. He was a real estate titan, a piranha in a sea of sharks who had built his empire. Thorne, consolidated by raising the old to make way for the gleaming, sterile new. He treated the city like his personal chessboard and its people as pawns. His 4 guests orbited him like nervous moons. There was Cynthia Vance, a socialite, whose face was a testament to the miracles of modern cosmetic surgery. 2 junior executives, Robert and Paul, both with identical haircuts and expressions of fawning adoration, and a grizzled lawyer named Henderson, whose job was to nod sagely and make Thorne's predatory instincts sound like sound legal strategy. Their waitress for the evening was Chloe Thompson. To Marcus Thorne and his guests, she was invisible, a functional automaton designed to ferry food and wine. They didn't notice the quiet intelligence in her hazel eyes, or the way she moved with an efficient grace that bespoke a deep underlying competence. They didn't see the faint smudge of graphite on her wrist, a remnant from the architectural drafting she'd been working on before her shift. They saw a uniform, a name tag, and a servant. Chloe had been working at Eithred's for 2 years. It was a brutal, demanding job, but it paid for her tuition at Cooper Union, where she was studying to become an architect. She endured the condescension and the casual cruelty of the city's elite because she had a goal. She saw the buildings they financed, the soulless glass towers Thorne himself erected, and she dreamed of creating spaces for people, not just for profit. Serving men like Thorne was a bitter pill, but a necessary one. She was a masterful observer. She'd learned to read a table in seconds. She knew from the way Thorne dismissed the sommelier's recommendation for the 1982 Petrus and instead demanded the flashy, overpriced, screaming Eagle Cabernet that he was a man of performance, not palate. She noted the way his guests laughed a fraction of a second, too late at his jokes, a chorus of calculated sycophancy. The meal was a performance of its own. Thorne held court, his voice a confident baritone that sliced through the restaurant's decorum. He recounted a recent hostile takeover with the glee of a big game hunter describing a kill. The board was squealing like pigs, he boomed, slicing into his Wagyu steak, telling me I was destroying a legacy. I told them legacy doesn't pay dividends. We gutted the pension fund by Tuesday, and the stock shot up 12% by Friday. Robert and Paul crotaled with manufactured delight. Cynthia Vance dabbed her lips with a napkin. You're so wonderfully ruthless, Marcus, she purred. Chloe moved silently around them, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, her face a mask of serene professionalism. But inside she was taking notes, not on the order, but on the man. She saw the casual cruelty, the utter lack of empathy, the black hole of an ego that consumed everything around it. He treated the staff with a particularly Gling brand of disdain. He never made eye contact, referring to Chloe only as sweetheart or darling, in a tone that was anything but. He snapped his fingers to get her attention, a gesture so demeaning it made her jaw clench. She had served billionaires before. Most were demanding, some were eccentric, but nearly all possessed a thin veneer of civility. Thorne had no such veneer. He seemed to revel in his own awfulness, wearing it like his expensive watch. As the evening wore on, the wine flowed freely. Thorne ordered a vintage port, a Louis XIII cognac, and a round of cigars that were not permitted in the main dining room. He made a show of complaining until the manager, a perpetually flustered Frenchman named Mr. Dubois, personally escorted them to a private smoking lounge, apologizing profusely for the inconvenience. Chloe watched the exchange, a knot tightening in her stomach. She saw how easily power bent the rules, how money could purchase not just luxury, but impunity. Mr. Dubois, a man who normally ran his dining room with the precision of a drill sergeant, was reduced to a booing, scraping supplicant in Thorne's presence. Finally, after 3 1/2 hours of unrestrained indulgence, the party returned to their table for the final bill. The desserts had been cleared, the coffee served. A quiet lull settled over the table, the comfortable silence of those who have consumed far more than they need. Chloe approached the table with the small obsidian tray. The leather folder containing the check felt heavier than usual. She placed it gently in the center of the table, equidistant from everyone, but aimed squarely at Marcus Thorne. "Thank you for dining with us, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice even and low. "Whenever you're ready." She retreated a respectful distance, standing near a service station, her posture perfect, her gaze directed at a point on the far wall. She could feel their eyes on her, but she did not flinch. This was the ritual, the final act of the play. But tonight she felt a strange electric premonition in the air. Something was about to break. Thorne let the bill sit for a full 5 minutes, a deliberate power move. He continued his story, ignoring the folder as if it were a speck of dust. Finally, with a theatrical sigh, he picked it up. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the itemized list for a brief second. And then he laughed. It wasn't a laugh of joy or amusement. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was a weapon designed to belittle and humiliate. The sound echoed in the cathedral-like silence of S. Diners at other tables paused forks halfway to their mouths. The spell of the gilded cage was broken. "You've got to be kidding me," Thorne announced to his table. Though his voice was loud enough for half the room to hear, he tossed the folder back onto the table. It skidded across the polished wood and stopped just short of Cynthia's wineglass. "I'm not paying this." The 3 words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "I'm not paying." It was a statement so alien to the ethos of ETH that for a moment no one knew how to react. It was like a guest at the opera suddenly starting to scream. Robert and Paul exchanged a nervous glance, their practiced smiles faltering. Cynthia Vance's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Only Henderson, the lawyer, looked unfazed, as if this were just another calculated move in his client's endless game. Chloe remained perfectly still, her training kicking in. "Never engage, never argue," alert the manager. It was the first rule. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned to fetch Mr. Dubois. Marcus Thorne saw the movement, and his smirk widened. "Oh, no, you don't, sweetheart. Don't go running off. You're the one who brought this piece of fiction." He gestured dismissively at the bill. "You can be the one to deal with it." Chloe paused, her back still to him, her hand hidden from his view, clenched into a fist. She took a slow, deliberate breath, unclenching her fingers one by one, and turned back to face him. "Is there a problem with the bill, sir?" she asked, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of professional calm. "A problem?" Thorne chuckled, leaning back in his chair and spreading his arms wide, a king addressing his court. "The problem, darling, is the entire experience. The wine was served a degree too warm. The steak, while acceptable, was hardly the life-altering event its price tag suggests. And your service, he finally let his cold eyes lock onto hers, was perfunctor, uninspired. I expect to be dazzled. I was not dazzled. It was Chloe knew a complete fabrication. She had checked the wine temperature herself. The steak was an A5 Kobe prepared by a chef who was a legend in the culinary world, and her service had been flawless, anticipating every need before it was voiced. This wasn't about a complaint. This was about power. It was a public demonstration of his own importance, a way of showing everyone that the normal rules of commerce and decency did not apply to Marcus Thorne. Before Chloe could respond, Mr. Dubois skirted over his face, pale and beaded with sweat. He had overheard Thorne's pronouncement and looked as though he might faint. "Mr. Thorne, sir, is everything all right?" "Forgive me, I heard a concern." Thorne waved a dismissive hand, not even bothering to look at the manager. "Your waitress here seems to think I'm going to pay nearly $9,000 for a mediocre meal. I was just explaining to her that she is mistaken." Dubois' eyes darted between the stone-faced billionaire and the impassive waitress. His instincts were all geared toward appeasement. The customer, especially a customer of this magnitude, was always right. "Of course, sir. Of course. Any displeasure is our deepest regret. Allow me to rectify the situation. Perhaps we can remove the wine from the bill or the desserts. Whatever you wish, sir." "Please." Mr. Dubois was practically wringing his hands, his French accent becoming thicker with anxiety. This was the reaction Thorne had expected, the immediate capitulation. It fed his ego, confirming his belief that the world was a hierarchy, and he stood at its apex. "Remove the desserts," Thorne scoffed. "Don't be insulting. I'm not some tourist trying to get a free slice of cheesecake. I'm making a point. The entire experience was a disappointment. Therefore, the entire bill is void." He said the word void with a finality that borked no argument. Mr. Dubois looked utterly lost. This was far outside the script. Comping a bottle of wine was one thing. Comping a bill of this size was unthinkable. It would mean his job. He looked at Chloe, a silent plea in his eyes, begging her to do something, anything. But what could she do? It was Chloe who finally broke the standoff. She took a step forward, her presence suddenly feeling more solid, more imposing than the trembling manager beside her. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice still quiet, but now laced with a thin wire of steel. "You and your guests consume the food and the wine. The staff provided the service. The policy of this establishment is that you are required to pay for what you have consumed." A hush fell over the surrounding tables. A waitress was challenging Marcus Thorne. This was not part of the evening's entertainment. Thorne's eyes narrowed. The amused smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. Who was this little girl in a black apron to quote policy at him? "Do you have any idea who I am?" He asked, the words low and menacing. It was the ultimate trump card, the question he believed could unlock any door and silence any dissent. "I know exactly who you are, sir," Chloe replied, her gaze unwavering. "You're the man at table 7, and your bill is $80,142.50. The sheer audacity of her response seemed to momentarily stun him. He had expected fear apologies begging. What he got was a statement of fact delivered with the cold finality of a bank teller. His face began to flush a deep angry red. "You're a brave little girl, aren't you? Let me explain how this works. I own half the block this restaurant is on. I could buy this place tomorrow, and your first act as my new employee would be to fire yourself. Now take this bill, tear it up, and bring me a glass of water." "My treat." His guests laughed a nervous, sycophantic titter. The challenge had been issued, and in their minds the outcome was certain. Mr. Dubois whimpered, "Mademoiselle Thompson, please let us not provoke Mr. Thorne." But Chloe wasn't looking at the manager. She was looking directly at Marcus Thorne, and a profound sense of clarity washed over her. She had spent years bowing and scraping to men like him, swallowing their insults, cleaning up their messes, all in service of a dream he would happily bulldoze to build another skyscraper. And in that moment, she decided she was done. The tuition, the job, none of it was worth this corrosive humiliation. Justice, she realized, was sometimes more important than prudence. Tearing up the bill is not an option, sir, she stated flatly. Thorne's face contorted into a mask of rage. Then you leave me no choice. This is your final chance. Get this worthless piece of paper out of my sight. Chloe held his gaze. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. She saw the challenge in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he would win, that he always won, and she made her decision. You're right, she said softly. You leave me no choice. And with that, she reached into the front pocket of her apron. It wasn't for a pen or a notepad. Her hand emerged holding a simple, well-worn smartphone. Thorne's guests looked on in amused confusion. Was she going to take a picture live stream his victory? Chloe ignored them. Her thumb moved deftly across the screen, navigating to her contacts. She scrolled to a name listed only as proprietor. Thorne watched a sneer forming on his lips. What are you going to do, sweetheart? Call the police. They'll be asking for your autograph when I'm done with them. Chloe didn't answer. She pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. The room was so quiet, the faint electronic ringing was audible. After 2 rings, it connected. Sir, Chloe said, her voice a paradigm of calm respect. I apologize for the late hour. It's Chloe Thompson at Eldridge. We have a situation here. A guest is refusing to pay his bill. She paused, listening. Yes, sir. The name is Marcus Thorne. The moment the name Marcus Thorne left Chloe's lips, the atmosphere at table 7 curdled. The amusement on the faces of his guests was replaced by a bewildered tension. Cynthia Vance's smile froze, looking like a porcelain mask about to crack. Robert and Paul shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their bravado evaporating into the carefully conditioned air. They were witnessing the unthinkable. The seamless world of their boss was being interrupted by a waitress with a phone. Thorne himself was momentarily taken back, not by fear, but by the sheer, unmitigated gall. He stared at Chloe as if she were a curious insect that had just learned to speak. The idea that she was calling someone who could possibly have any authority over him was so ludicrous it was almost comical. Who are you calling, little girl? He sneered, recovering his composure. The manager of the night shift, the head chef. Let me save you the trouble. Nobody in this building has the authority to tell me what to do. Chloe held up a single polite finger, asking for a moment's silence as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. Her side of the conversation was maddeningly brief and professional, giving away nothing. Yes, sir, she said into the phone. The full bill, 8 timbers, $742.50. No, he hasn't given a legitimate reason. He stated he was not dazzled by the experience. A muscle in Thorne's jaw twitched violently. Hearing his own arrogant words repeated back, so plainly stripped of their power and presented as a petulant complaint, was infuriating. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being disgusted by unseen forces of not being in complete control. Give me that phone, he snarled, starting to rise from his seat. I'll speak to this proprietor of yours and sort out this nonsense. Chloe took a small step back, deftly keeping the phone out of his reach. Her movement was fluid and certain, not one of fear, but of control. He'd like to speak with you, sir, she said, her voice remaining placid. But he asked me to confirm one thing first. She listened for another moment, her eyes never leaving Thorne's face. Yes, I understand. She lowered the phone slightly. He asked me to ask you if you remember a man named Daniel Sterling. The name hit the air and seemed to hang there shimmering and dangerous. It was not a name Thorne had expected to hear in this context, or perhaps ever again. For the first time that evening, a genuine, unplanned emotion broke through his carefully constructed facade. A flicker of confusion quickly followed by a shadow of something else, something much deeper. Recognition. Henderson, the lawyer who had been observing the proceedings with a detached legal curiosity, suddenly sat bolt upright, his head snapped toward Thorne, his eyes wide with alarm. The name Daniel Sterling clearly meant something to him too. Thorne's blustering confidence seemed to deflate just a little. The angry red in his cheeks subsided, replaced by a paler shade. Sterling, he repeated the name, tasting strange in his mouth. What does Daniel Sterling have to do with anything? He's the man I'm speaking with, sir, Chloe said simply. He owns this restaurant. Well, he's the silent majority partner, the real owner. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. The sycophants at the table fell silent, their gazes darting between the suddenly pale billionaire and the calm, unassuming waitress. The power dynamic, which had been so firmly tilted in Thorne's favor, had just been put on a fulcrum, and it was beginning to tip in a direction no one could have predicted. Daniel Sterling was not just a name to Marcus Thorne. He was a ghost from a past Thorne had worked very hard to bury. Sterling was the old money investor, the quiet, principled mentor who had given Thorne his first major loan, his first real start in the ruthless world of New York real estate. He had seen potential in the young, hungry Marcus, but had eventually been pushed aside when Thorne's ambition curdled into pure avarice. Their parting had been acrimonious, a bitter clash of ideologies. Sterling believed in building communities, Thorne, in building monuments to himself. Thorne had gone on to build his empire, telling himself he had surpassed the old man, that Sterling's cautious, ethical approach was a relic of a bygone era. He hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, and now a waitress in a 3-star Michelin restaurant was on the phone with him about an unpaid dinner bill. The absurdity of it was matched only by the cold dread coiling in Thorne's stomach. "That's impossible," Thorne stammered, his voice losing its baritonal authority. "Sterling is retired. He's in Switzerland or some other godforsaken place. He's on the phone, sir." Chloe repeated, her patience seemingly infinite. "And he is asking to speak with you." She held the phone out. It was no longer just a phone. It was a summons, a judgment. The sneer was gone from Thorne's face. The arrogance had been stripped away layer by a single name and a single phone call. He was no longer the titan of industry, the master of the universe. He was just Marcus, the brash young man who had once stood captain in Daniel Sterling's office, begging for a chance. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. His guests watched, mesmerized by the slow-motion collapse of the man they had spent the evening adoring. They were seeing behind the curtain, and the sight was not impressive. Thorne took the phone from Chloe's steady hand. It felt cold and heavy, a conduit to a past he could not escape. He raised it to his ear, his throat suddenly dry. "Sterling," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The voice that came through the receiver was not loud or angry. It was worse. It was calm, measured, and freighted with the unmistakable weight of disappointment. It was the voice of a man who had seen everything done, everything, and was no longer capable of being surprised, only saddened. "Marcus," the voice said, the single word carrying with it the history of a dozen years of silence. "It's been a long time. I hear you're not enjoying your dinner." Marcus Thorne froze. The voice, unchanged by the years, instantly transported him back. He was 28 again, standing in Sterling's sprawling book-lined office, overlooking Central Park, sweating in his cheap suit as he pitched his first big project. Sterling had been his idol, the epitome of class power and integrity, a man who could move markets with a single phone call, but who always treated the doorman with the same respect as a visiting CEO. A man whose approval Thorne had once craved more than anything. "Daniel." Thorne managed to say, his voice cracking. He instinctively turned away from his guests as if to shield himself from their prying eyes. "I don't understand. What is this? It's a joke." The voice on the other end let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Do I sound like I'm joking, Marcus? I own several businesses. Ethel Reds is one of them, a quiet investment. I find the culinary arts to be a fascinating intersection of discipline and creativity, and I make it a point to know what happens within my establishments." Thorne's mind was racing, trying to process the sheer catastrophic unlikelihood of this moment. Of all the restaurants in all of New York, he had to walk into Daniel Sterling's. He had to choose tonight to pull this arrogant stunt. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for ironic punishment. "Listen, Daniel, this is just a misunderstanding." Thorne began, his tone shifting from blustering to pleading. "The service was a little off. I had a little too much wine. I was making a point." "You were making a point." Sterling's voice cut through his excuses, the calm tone now edged with ice. "What point were you trying to make, Marcus? That you're so powerful you don't have to pay for what you consume? That you can humiliate a young woman doing her job just to entertain your sickens? That's not a point, Marcus. That's a character flaw. A fly I had hoped you would have outgrown by now." Each word was a precisely aimed dart, puncturing Thorne's ego. He glanced back at his table. Cynthia, Robert, and Paul were staring at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Henderson, the lawyer, had his face in his hands, sensing a legal and financial storm on the horizon. The power Thorne had so carefully cultivated over them had vanished. He was being scolded like a child. "It wasn't like that," Thorne insisted, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "You don't know the full story." "I know enough," Sterling countered. "I have a camera feed of the entire dining room on my home computer. It's a security measure. I saw you snap your fingers at Miss Thompson. I heard you call her sweetheart in that tone you use when you're trying to diminish someone. And I just watched you try to bully her and my manager into submission. The only misunderstanding here, Marcus, is your belief that your wealth absolves you from basic human decency." The mention of the camera feed sent a fresh jolt of horror through Thorne. He had been performing on a stage he didn't even know existed for an audience of one. The one person whose opinion deep down still mattered. "Daniel, please," he said, the words catching in his throat. "Let's not do this over the phone. Let me make it right." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Thorne could hear the faint sound of a clock ticking each second, stretching into an eternity. He was sweating freely now, his expensive suit feeling like a straitjacket. Making it right is an interesting concept. "Marcus," Sterling's voice finally returned colder than before. "Making it right would have been treating the staff with respect from the moment you walked in. Making it right would have been paying your bill and leaving a generous tip for the excellent service you received. But we are long past that point. Now we are at the point of consequences." "Consequences? What are you talking about? It's a dinner bill." "No, Marcus. It's never just about the bill," Sterling said, his voice low and grave. "It's about the principle. I have a young woman on my staff, Chloe Thompson, who is working her way through architecture school. She is brilliant, hardworking, and possesses more integrity in her little finger than you have displayed tonight in your entire being. She is exactly the kind of person I built my businesses to support. And you, Marcus, are the kind of person I built them to withstand." The specific mention of Chloe's name of her ambition was another shock. Sterling knew his staff. He didn't just own the restaurant, he was invested in it, in its people. Thorne had never bothered to learn the name of a single person who had served him in his life. "So here is what is going to happen," Sterling continued his voice, leaving no room for negotiation. "First, you are going to hand the phone back to Miss Thompson." Thorne hesitated. Giving the phone back felt like the final act of surrender. "Now, Marcus," Sterling's voice commanded, and Thorne found himself obeying without a second thought. He turned his face ashen and extended the phone to Chloe. She took it with the same steady hand, her expression giving nothing away. He couldn't meet her eyes. He, Marcus Thorne, could not look his waitress in the eye. He felt a wave of humiliation so profound it was physically nauseating. Chloe put the phone to her ear. "Yes, sir," she said. She listened intently for nearly a minute, her gaze fixed on Thorne. The entire restaurant was now watching the silent drama unfold. The clinking of cutlery had ceased. The low hum of conversation had died. There was only the quiet, damning spectacle at table 7. Finally, Chloe lowered the phone. She looked at Marcus Thorne, and for the first time he saw something other than professional detachment in her eyes. It wasn't triumph or anger. It was a kind of weary pity. "Mr. Sterling has instructed me on how we are to proceed," she announced, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence. The past had a funny way of showing up unannounced. For Marcus Thorne, it hadn't just knocked on the door. It had kicked it down in the middle of his victory feast. The voice of Daniel Sterling, a ghost he thought long since exorcised, had stripped him bare in front of his court of gestures. Now he stood exposed a king without his crown, waiting for a waitress to deliver the verdict. "Mr. Sterling's instructions are very specific." Chloe began her voice, holding the unwavering authority that had been passed to her through the phone. She addressed Thorne, but her words were for the entire silent audience. "First, you will pay the bill, the full amount. In fact, you will pay double." A collective gasp, though faint, rippled through the nearby tables. Thorne's jaw dropped. Double that was over $17,000. It wasn't the money he could lose that in a bad stock trade and not even notice. It was the punitive nature of the demand. It was a fine. a penalty for his behavior. That's outrageous, he sputtered, a last flicker of his old arrogance fighting its way to the surface. That is the first condition, Chloe said, ignoring his protest as if it were the buzz of a fly. The additional $8,742.50 will be distributed equally among the staff who had the displeasure of serving you tonight. Mr. Sterling calls it a character tax. The term hung in the air, a perfect stinging encapsulation of the situation. Robert and Paul sank lower in their chairs, wishing the plush leather would swallow them whole. Cynthia Vance was examining her manicure with an intensity that suggested it was the most fascinating thing in the world. Second, Chloe continued, her eyes locked on Thorne. You will apologize. I already said it was a misunder. No, Chloe cut him off, her voice sharp for the first time. Not to Mr. Sterling. Not to me. You will stand up and you will apologize to the entire staff of this restaurant. You will apologize to the chef whose food you insulted, to the busboys you ignored, to the sommier whose expertise you dismissed, and to Mr. Dubois for the stress you have caused him. Mr. Dubois, who had been hiding behind a large potted fern, looked as though he might cry with a mixture of terror and relief. And then Chloe's voice softened, almost imperceptibly, yet gained a new weight. You will apologize to me, you will look me in the eye, and you will apologize for your disrespect. This was the true punishment. It was a ritual of humiliation designed by a master of it. Sterling knew that for a man like Thorne, public shame was a fate worse than financial loss. His entire identity was built on the perception of power. This apology would shatter that perception into a million pieces. Thorne stood frozen in his mind, a maelstrom of rage, shame, and disbelief. He looked around the room at the faces of strangers watching him, their expressions ranging from pity to schadenfreude. He saw his guests, his supposed allies, refusing to meet his gaze. He was utterly alone. He could, of course, refuse. He could storm out, unleash his lawyers, and create a media firestorm, but he knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that it would be a losing battle. Daniel Sterling was not a man to bluff, and the story billionaire bully Marcus Thorne refuses to pay humiliates. Waitress would be a public relations nightmare from which he might never recover. More than that, he would have made a permanent enemy of a man who knew all his old secrets. Slowly, painfully, as if his joints were rusted shut, he pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He was a tall man, but in that moment he seemed to shrink. The custom suit now looked like a costume he was unworthy of wearing. He cleared his throat, but the sound that came out was a dry rasp. He tried again. I would like to apologize, he said, his voice arcing shadow of its former self. He couldn't bring himself to look at anyone, his eyes fixed on a spot on the tablecloth. To the staff, your work was exemplary. I was wrong to suggest otherwise. He turned vaguely in the direction of the kitchen. To the chef, the meal was superb. My compliments. He then looked at Mr. Dubois, who flinched as if expecting a blow. Mr. Dubois, I am sorry for my behavior. Each word felt like it was being pulled from him with pliers. The apology was stilted, awkward, and deeply insincere. Yet the act of saying it at all was a profound concession of defeat. Then came the final, most difficult part. He had to turn to Chloe. He forced his head up and met her gaze. Her hazel eyes were clear and steady, holding no malice, only an expectation of what was owed. Miss Thompson, he said, the name feeling foreign and formal. He couldn't bring himself to say her first name. My conduct was unacceptable. I was rude and demeaning. I apologize. Chloe held his gaze for a long moment, letting the apology settle in the silent room. She then gave a single brief nod. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement, a transaction completed. Your apology is noted, she said. Now the final matter. She handed him the phone. Mr. Sterling wishes to speak with you one last time. With a trembling hand, Thorne took the phone back. He felt a cold premonition, a sense that the worst was yet to come. The bill and the apology were just the prelude. He put the phone to his ear. Daniel, he whispered, I trust that is settled, Marcus. Sterling's voice said, devoid of any warmth. A man's character is not defined by how he treats his equals, but his supposed inferiors. You failed that test tonight spectacularly. I understand, Thorne mumbled. I don't think you do. Not yet, Sterling said. You see, this wasn't just about a restaurant, Bill. It was about a much larger one. Do you remember the Vidian Tower project? The one we were partners on before you forced me out. The centerpiece of your empire. Thorne's blood ran cold. The Vidian Tower was his flagship building, the crown jewel of Thorne Consolidated. What about it? He asked, his voice shaking. My investment firm still holds a significant, though minority stake in that project's primary mortgage, Sterling said calmly. A detail I'm sure your accountants have overlooked for years. And there is a morals clause in our original partnership agreement. A clause Henderson here, he said, and Thorne knew Sterling was watching the lawyer squirm via the camera. Probably told you was unenforceable boilerplate. It stipulates that any action by a majority partner that brings public disrepute or demonstrates gross moral turpitude can trigger a buyout option at the original valuation. Henderson's head shot up his face, a mask of pure terror. He knew exactly what that meant. Given your public performance tonight, which I have on high-definition video, by the way, I am officially triggering that clause. Sterling continued, his voice as calm as a surgeon announcing a terminal diagnosis. My people will be in touch with your people in the morning. We are buying you out of your own building, Marcus, at a price from 10 years ago. It will cost you hundreds of millions. It may very well bankrupt you. Thorne felt the floor drop out from under him. He stumbled back, catching himself on the table. The glasses rattled. He couldn't breathe. It wasn't just shame anymore. It was ruin. Complete and utter ruin. All because of an $87 $50 dinner bill. All because he couldn't stomach the idea of a waitress standing up to him. Daniel, no you can't, he pleaded, his voice breaking completely. Please, it was one night, one mistake. No, Marcus, the voice on the line said, and now it held a note of final profound sadness. It wasn't one mistake. It was the mistake. It was the culmination of 1,000 small cruelties, 1,000 moments where you chose arrogance over kindness. Tonight you just happened to do it in my restaurant. Goodbye, Marcus. The line went dead. Thorne stood there holding the silent phone, a ghost in the wreckage of his own life. The silence that followed the deadline was more profound than any sound. It was a vacuum sucking all the air and life out of Table 7. Marcus Thorne stood motionless, the phone still pressed to his ear, as if hoping to hear a reprieve that would never come. His face, once a portrait of arrogant power, was now a slack, ashen mask of utter devastation. The Vidian Tower, his monument, his legacy, it was all turning to dust. Chloe calmly took the phone from his nerveless grasp, placed it back in her apron, and produced a portable credit card machine. She placed it on the table in front of him. The total charge will be 7-tone 480, she said, her voice a simple statement of fact devoid of triumph. Will that be Visa or American Express, Mr. Thorne? The mundane question was so shockingly normal in the midst of his life's collapse that it seemed to break the spell. Thorne stared at the machine as if it were an alien artifact. He fumbled for his wallet. His usually nimble fingers turned clumsy and useless. He pulled out a black no-limit Amex card and practically threw it on the table. Chloe took the card, swiped it, and entered the amount. The machine worded and spat out a receipt. The entire process was executed with a quiet, devastating efficiency. She placed the receipt and a pen in front of him. He scribbled a meaningless signature, his hand shaking so badly it was illegible. His guests, who had been frozen in a state of horrified paralysis, finally began to stir. The spell was broken. Their allegiance, which had always been tethered to his power and wealth, had been irrevocably severed. They saw before them not a titan, but a broken man. And weakness is a contagion. The powerful flea from Cynthia Vance was the first to move. She stood up, gathering her ridiculously expensive handbag. Well, Marcus, she said, her voice dripping with a false saccharine sympathy that was more insulting than any anger could have been. This has been an evening. I really must be going. Early morning. She didn't wait for a reply, turning and walking away with a speed that suggested the restaurant was on fire. Robert and Paul scrambled to their feet, next mumbling incoherent excuses. Meeting early start. Sorry, Marcus. They scurried away like rats from a sinking ship, not even making eye contact with their now deposed king. Only Henderson, the lawyer, remained. He looked at Thorne, his face a grim landscape of professional and personal ruin. "Marcus," he said, his voice heavy, "we need to talk." "Not here. I'll call you in an hour. We need to see if there's any way to fight this." But his tone held no hope. He knew a morals clause invoked by a man like Daniel Sterling, backed by video evidence, was an ironclad coffin. He sighed, pushed his chair in, and walked away, a man heading toward the gallows of his own making. In the space of 5 minutes, Marcus Thorne had lost everything: his flagship property, his financial security, and the false loyalty of his followers. He was left alone at a table littered with the remains of a feast he could no longer afford in a restaurant owned by the man who had just destroyed him. He finally looked up, his eyes finding Chloe's. They were filled with a terrifying cocktail of rage, despair, and for the first time a sliver of genuine, pathetic pleading. He opened his mouth to say something, a threat, a plea, an insult, but no words came out. What was there to say? He had been so thoroughly, so comprehensively dismantled that there was nothing left. Without another word, he turned and stumbled away from the table. He didn't walk with his usual confident stride. He shuffled his shoulders, slumped, a man, aged 20 years in 20 minutes. As he passed through the bronze doors of Eath's and out into the New York night, he didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like just another man broken by the city. The moment he was gone, the restaurant seemed to exhale. A low murmur rippled through the room as diners began to speak again, processing the incredible drama they had just witnessed. Several patrons caught Chloe's eye and gave her small, respectful nods. One older gentleman at a nearby table raised his glass to her in a silent toast. Mr. Dubois approached her, his face a mess of conflicting emotions. He was a ruck, terrified, and profoundly grateful. "Mademoiselle Thompson." "Chloe, I do not know what to say," he stammered. "I have never in my 30 years in this business seen anything like that. You were formidable." "I was just doing my job, Mr. Dubois," she said quietly, though she felt a tremor in her own hands now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You did more than that. You stood up when I faltered. You have more courage than I." He looked at her with a newfound deep respect. "The owner, Mr. Sterling, he is truly a remarkable man." "Yes, he is," Chloe agreed. Her phone buzzed in her apron. She pulled it out. It was a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Well done, Miss Thompson. Please wait for my car. We have more to discuss." DS, a sleek black Bentley, pulled up to the curb a few minutes later, its engine a low, contented purr. The staff entrance, usually a place of cigarette breaks and hurried conversations, was silent. As Chloe stepped out, the driver, a man in a crisp suit, opened the rear door for her without a word. She slid onto the soft leather seat. The interior of the car was silent, smelling of wealth and quiet competence. As the car pulled away from Ethel Red's, she watched the city lights slide past the window. She had entered the restaurant that evening as a waitress, a student struggling to make ends meet. She was leaving as something else entirely, though she wasn't yet sure what. The reckoning had been for Marcus Thorne, but she had a feeling her own new chapter was just beginning. The Bentley moved through the streets of Manhattan with a serene, unhurried grace, a bubble of tranquility amidst the city's chaotic energy. Chloe stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape transform into something new and strange. She had walked these streets 1,000 times, feeling their unforgiving pavement under her worn-out shoes, always looking up at the towering buildings with a sense of yearning. Tonight, for the first time, she felt as if she were seeing them at eye level. The car didn't head downtown toward her small apartment. Instead, it journeyed uptown, finally pulling to a stop in front of a magnificent pre-war building overlooking Central Park. This was a world of doormen in braided coats and hushed marble lobbies, a world Chloe had only ever observed from the outside. The driver escorted her to a private elevator, which opened directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment. The space was breathtaking. It was not ostentatious like Thorne's world. It was a testament to quiet, confident taste. Walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Art by modern masters hung in understated frames, and through a vast wall of glass, the entirety of Central Park was laid out below, like a dark, glittering tapestry. Standing by the window, a glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand, was a man in his late 70s. He was tall and silver-haired with a kind, intelligent face and eyes that seemed to hold a century of wisdom. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. There was an aura of immense calm and power about him. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice the same calm, measured tone she had heard on the phone. "Daniel Sterling, thank you for coming." "Mr. Sterling," Chloe replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her stomach. "It's an honor. Please call me Daniel." And the honor was all mine. What you did tonight took a remarkable amount of courage and integrity. I haven't seen a display like that in a very long time. He gestured to a chair opposite him. "Please sit." Chloe sat, her posture still reflecting the perfect poise of her waitress training. "I imagine you have some questions," he said with a small smile. "A few," she admitted. "How did you know about me, about my studies?" Daniel took a sip of his drink and looked out at the park. "I believe in knowing's my investments, Chloe, and my most important investments are not buildings or businesses, but people. When I took over Ethelese, I made it my business to read the file of every employee. Your file stood out. Top of your class at Cooper Union, a scholarship student, an ambition to be an architect. Your file also mentioned your father." Chloe stiffened slightly. "My father, Robert Thompson. He was an architect, a brilliant one. He worked for my firm Sterling and Associates for a few years in the early 90s. He was one of the most principled men I ever knew. He believed architecture was a public trust, not just a commodity. He would have hated what Marcus Thorne has done to this city's skyline." Chloe was stunned into silence. Her father had died when she was young, and she knew very little about his professional life, only that he had been a passionate but financially unsuccessful architect. "Your father and I had our disagreements," Daniel continued, his expression wistful. "He was an idealist, I was a pragmatist, but I never forgot his talent or his character. When I saw his name on your file, I decided to keep an eye on you. I wanted to see if that same integrity had been passed down." Tonight he turned to look at her directly, his eyes full of warmth. "You proved that it has, and then some." A wave of emotion washed over Chloe. It was all so much to take in. The confrontation with Thorne, the destruction of a powerful man, and now this connection to a past she barely knew. "So, the cameras, the phone call, it wasn't a coincidence," she said, piecing it together. "Let's call it a prepared contingency," Daniel said with a wry smile. "I knew of Marcus's reputation. I suspected that one day his monstrous ego might lead him to my door. I simply made sure that if he did, the house would be ready for him. You were the catalyst I couldn't have planned for. You were the one who refused to bend." He set his glass down and leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Which brings me to why I asked you here. A job as a waitress, no matter how prestigious the restaurant, is a waste of your talents. My firm, Sterling and Associates, is beginning a new urban renewal project. We're not building glass towers for billionaires. We're designing mixed-income housing, public parks, community centers. We're trying to build something that lasts, something that serves people, the kind of work your father believed in." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I am offering you a position, Chloe, a paid internship to start. You will work alongside our lead architects. You will have a seat at the table. Your tuition and living expenses will be covered. I am offering you a chance to build the world you want to see instead of just serving the men who are tearing it down." Tears welled in Chloe's eyes. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, an opportunity she never thought she would get handed to her because of one moment of quiet defiance. It wasn't a reward. It was a recognition of who she had been all along. She thought of all the nights she'd spent sketching designs after a long shift, her hands aching, her mind buzzing with ideas. She thought of Marcus Thorne, a man who had everything and valued nothing. And she thought of her father, a man she barely knew, but whose legacy of integrity had just unlocked her future. "Mr. Sterling, Daniel," she said, her voice thick with emotion, but her resolve clear as glass. "I would be honored." "Yes, absolutely, yes." A genuine, brilliant smile lit up Daniel Sterling's face. "Excellent," he said. "Welcome to the firm, Chloe. Your first day is Monday. Now, I believe you are owed about $4,000 in a character tax. Let's see about getting you that bonus. As Chloe rode home in the Bentley, the city lights seemed to shine a little brighter. She was no longer just a waitress serving the powerful. She was an architect in the making, an heir to a legacy of integrity, ready to start building a better world, one blueprint at a time. The reckoning at Eldra's had not just been the end of Marcus Thorne's story, it was the true beginning of her own. What a story of poetic justice. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't measured by wealth or status, but by character and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when you feel powerless. Chloe Thompson didn't have $1 billion, but she had something Marcus Thorne could never buy: integrity. And in the end, that was the most valuable currency of all. It shows that sometimes in the grand theater of life, the quietest voice can cause the loudest echo. And one single phone call can change everything. If this story of courage and consequence resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share it with someone who loves a good story of an underdog coming out on top. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next real-life drama. Thank you for listening.